is environmental politics? And what is environmental policy? Basically, what is this class about? So let's take a couple minutes and break down those terms, environmental politics, environmental policy, and determine sort of what they're about so we have a good foundation to understand what we're looking at this semester. First, let's ask ourselves, what is policy? Well, policy is basically the sort of guide to legislative action, the framework, the idea that drives the production of individual laws, as well as the implementation, enforcement, and evaluation of those laws. So it's kind of vague, right? But let's give an example. Let's actually look at an example from outside of environmental policy. Let's say for a second that the current president decides to implement a student loan forgiveness program that would be a one-time forgiveness program. So, for example, the Biden administration recently proposed that. And it would give a one-time loan forgiveness for a chunk of many students' student loans. Now, that in and of itself is not a policy. That is a specific action, a specific, in this case, executive order, which ultimately has been overturned by the Supreme Court. But that individual thing, and even then the Supreme Court's action overturning it, that was not policy. That was specific, one-off type deal. Policy, though, drove that specific one-off type deal. The Biden administration's policy on making education more affordable and easier for people to access. So that was one component of that. There are other components. There's recently been a new loan repayment program put into place. The Biden administration is also exploring ways of making colleges more affordable, like community colleges and state schools. So, like Kingsborough, for example. So that is perhaps education policy, right? And that specific take on education policy, the idea of increasing access and affordability, that was manifested in this one specific action. So you can see policy is the overarching idea, and then there are individual laws within that area of policy. So what is politics now, right? Politics, as the political science Harold Lasswell said, is the struggle over who gets what, when, and how. That's actually a really good way of thinking about politics. And you'll notice that that definition does not say anything about the government. That's because politics doesn't have to involve the government, right? You might have heard the phrase office politics before. When you're in an office, there's weird dynamics that you have to navigate, right? Maybe you have a boss and then your boss has a boss, and your boss happens to be out sick for the day. Should you go to your boss's boss to ask them a question, or should you wait until your regular boss is back in? What are the sort of politics of that, right? Who has the power? How are you navigating that, right? That struggle of who gets what, when, and how. Now, obviously, for our purposes, we are going to be focusing on the government, but we are also going to be referring to things that sometimes happen outside the government, like interest group activities and how voters behave and how the public hears about the environment, right? So what the media has to say and how we in the public consume that. We're also going to be looking outside our own government at international governance, rather. So things like the UN. And we will also take a narrow review on state and local governments. So again, politics isn't just like our government. It's all sorts of different players and institutions struggling over who gets what, when, and how. So what's environmental policy then? And what's environmental politics? Well, environmental policy is just that overarching idea, that big guide towards making and enforcing and implementing and evaluating laws about the environment. And when we say the environment, we don't just mean the climate, right? We mean all sorts of aspects of the environment. Things like land use, toxic waste dumping, regular waste, like solid waste management. We have air, water, animals, forests, all sorts of different things are involved when we say the environment. So, environmental policy is a really big area, and it might not always look like environmental policy. Economic policy often has to do with the environment. Energy policy has to do with the environment. So, when we talk about environmental policy, we often are talking about a really big area that overlaps with other policy realms, as we're going to see. And that leads us to the politics of environmental policy, right? This struggle over who gets what, when, and how. And in this case, we're looking at how politics, how that struggle affects the environment and policies made about the environment. So we're going to be looking at different areas of political science. So political theory, American government, international relations, and comparative government, in order to look at how politics affects the environment. And remember that when we say politics, we don't just mean the government. We also mean political actors, like political parties, politicians, bureaucrats, voters, interest groups, the media, right? Also, I keep saying voters, but non-voters in the public too, they matter as well. And how, of course, those government institutions, right? The federal government, state governments, the Constitution, which could be considered an institution in and of itself, how these different things affect environmental policy. And we're also going to be looking at how the policy process, which includes existing policy, making policy, and evaluating policy, how that's affected by politics. So we're going to look at all this. It's a big topic, and we're only going to look at pieces of it this semester, but that's grounding for you in what policy, politics, and then environmental policy and environmental politics means, and we'll obviously be working with those definitions and refining them as the semester goes on.